Do you want to learn how to create a modern CI/CD pipeline in Jenkins? This hands-on course will take you from the absolute basics to being able to run a simple application in the cloud, all this while going through the stages of building, testing, and deploying. No lengthy introduction, useless examples, or tedious theory, just practical, actionable steps. But before you invest any more time in watching this course, let me address 3 common questions. Is this course any good for absolute beginners? What Jenkins pipeline are we going to build? And finally, is Jenkins still relevant today? First of all, I've created this course for complete beginners. I will break down Jenkins, CI/CD, and Docker as if you're hearing about them for the first time. We will start from installing Jenkins and take small, manageable steps toward a complete CI/CD pipeline. Whether you're on Windows, macOS, or Linux, you can follow along. So what exactly are we building? We'll create a simple website using Node.js in our build process. But do not worry if you use Python, Java, PHP, .NET, or any other technology. The principles we cover will be universally applicable since I'll be showing you how to run the pipeline using Docker containers. You will also learn to configure and run unit tests, end-to-end tests, publish reports, and deploy using the cloud provider Netlify. But isn't Jenkins obsolete? While Jenkins is no spring chicken, it remains a critical tool in many organizations. This course will teach you modern DevOps practices, including using Docker as a build environment and writing our pipeline as code with a Jenkins file. These skills are transferable to any CI/CD tool you may want to use in the future, so you're definitely not wasting any time learning Jenkins. And if any of this sounds unfamiliar, don't worry, I'll take you through this step by step. I typically don't speak so fast. By the way, my name is Valentine and I will be guiding you through this course. A PDF with the course notes and all the pipeline scripts is available for download, otherwise you won't be able to follow along. And with that being said, I think we have everything we need to get started, so let's go build some Jenkins pipelines. Priya is a software developer and works together with a small team at developing a web application. Every time the customer requests a change, she has to rebuild the software, test it, and upload it to a web server so that the customer can use the new version. While Priya loves writing code, the entire process afterwards is repetitive and, quite honestly, boring. Quite often, mistakes happen and the application does not work as expected or is completely offline for a while. Priya raises this problem in one of the team's sprint retrospectives, and Alex, another team member, suggests using a tool like Jenkins. But what is Jenkins? Jenkins is a free and open source automation server mainly used to automatically build and test software. To put this in more simple terms, Jenkins is like a robot assistant that can automatically do specific tasks on a computer, particularly tasks related to building, testing, and deploying software. Jenkins is like an assistant for software development. Every time Priya writes or updates a piece of software, Jenkins can compile the software to ensure it is written correctly, run tests to make sure everything works as expected, create a ready-to-use version of the software, and deploy it to a server and make it available for users. All this can happen without lifting a finger. So while Priya is taking a short coffee break after completing work on a new feature, Jenkins is working hard in the background to get the new version released. This process helps Priya and her team catch issues early, ensures the software is always in a good state, and automates many manual tasks, making the entire software development process more efficient and enjoyable. In technical terms, Jenkins is a continuous integration and continuous deployment tool. At its heart, it's all about automation and making repetitive tasks easier and more consistent. In this course, we will look at how to use Jenkins to build a web application. We will start from scratch by covering the absolute basics and go all the way up and figure how to deploy this app in the cloud. Throughout the course, I will also explain different Linux commands you need to know and also clarify the jargon you keep hearing like DevOps, CI/CD, and who knows what else. So if you need to learn Jenkins because your team is already using it, let's not waste any time and dig right into it. There are various ways of installing Jenkins. If you already have Jenkins installed, it may not be configured in a way that allows you to follow along with this course. I recommend using Docker with this course so that all examples I am showing work exactly the same. If you decide to install Jenkins in some other way, the examples presented may not work as expected, and it will be very hard for me to help you troubleshoot the problems. I try to make this installation process as painless as possible, so here's the plan in a nutshell. First of all, we're going to download Docker Desktop because this allows you to run Docker on your own computer. And I prepared a repository which contains a Docker configuration which you can easily start. And once this configuration has been started and Jenkins is running, we need to go inside Jenkins and configure it and essentially start using it. So let's go a bit into the details. First, you need to install Docker Desktop on your computer. There are installation packages for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. If you check the resources folder, you will notice that I've included detailed installation instructions as well as some troubleshooting tips. Yes, it's no secret, for some of you, getting Docker Desktop to run can be a bit more challenging, but generally should be an easy installation. I also recommend creating a Docker account. This is how Docker Desktop looks on my computer. Once Docker Desktop is up and running, we actually want to check if everything is working well. So we're going to use the following command, docker run, and we're going to start an image which is called hello world. I'm going to write hello-world. So initially this image is not available locally, so it needs to be downloaded. And if you're seeing here this message, hello from Docker, it means that your Docker installation is perfect. Everything is up and running. The next step would be to download the configuration needed to start Jenkins using Docker. I already prepared here a repository on GitHub, and depending on your skills, you can use Git to clone it or simply from here from code, download the entire zip. I'm going to take the option of cloning this repository, so I'm going to copy it and then go to a terminal and use git clone and then paste the address. This will essentially copy this entire Git repository locally. The name of the directory is install-jenkins-docker. I'm going to use cd for change directory. I'm going to type here a few letters and enter the directory install Jenkins Docker. Now, inside this directory, there are a few commands that we need to run, and these commands are also specified here. So the first command that we need to run is this one. So this will build a Docker image containing Jenkins. All you have to do is copy this command, hit enter, and wait a few seconds until this image is being created. You only need to do this once, so don't worry, it doesn't matter so much what we're doing right now. Once this image has been created and we don't see any errors, we can jump then to step 3. I'm going to simply start Jenkins. I'm going to use here Control-L to clear my terminal and paste the new command. This is using Docker Compose to start Jenkins. First time we're running these commands, it does take a bit of time because Docker needs to download all these images, but once they have been downloaded and are stored on your computer, running these commands will be very, very fast. Okay, so what we'll see here is that the containers have been started. So if everything looks green, you don't see any errors, it means that everything is fine. And then finally, to check if Jenkins is running, we're going to go to localhost on port 8080. So I'm going to click on this and simply use my browser to go to this page. And there are a few steps that we still need to do here in Jenkins. We have now reached step number 3, where we need to do a few things. So Jenkins has been started, but it's currently not configured. We need to configure a few things. It only takes a few minutes. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to unlock Jenkins. And this is like a security thing. We only do this once during the installation. And we're given here some instructions. And essentially in a file, there is like an initial admin password that we need to grab. Now, I'm not sure about your Linux skills, so I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible. So what we're going to do here is going to copy this path here. and we're going to go here to Docker Desktop. Now, what you should see in Docker Desktop here are at least two things. You're going to see here this container here with the image hello world. This is what we executed the first time when we have installed Docker Desktop, just to check if everything is up and running. We don't need this anymore, so we can simply go ahead and remove it from here. And what we're actually seeing here is this install Jenkins Docker, and this contains two images. Essentially, this image, my Jenkins, is like where Jenkins is running. So if we're clicking on this, we can directly interact with the container that is running Jenkins. So this container has some files here, and it also contains some logs. You'll see here on the logs somewhere, there are essentially the installation logs of Jenkins, and we're getting here this password that we need for the initial setup. So this is available here in the logs. If for some reason you don't see this in the logs, there's also a different way of accessing this. So another approach would be to go here to exec. This allows us to write a command directly in the container. So for example, we can use the cat command, which has absolutely nothing to do with cats, to print the information there. So cat and the path that we have copied, and this gives us the exact same password. Let's go back to Jenkins and complete the installation process. I'm going to paste here this password. You don't need to worry about this password. We don't need to save it or something like that. We're not going to need it. Now, in the next step, we are being asked about customizing Jenkins. Now, Jenkins, essentially, it's just a skeleton, and it's just a platform. And what actually makes Jenkins are a lot of plugins that are added to this platform. So we're going to go here with install suggested plugins, because these are like kind of like plugins that we'll be needing all the time. And we don't want to go afterwards and individually install different plugins. And this will take a few minutes to download and install. You'll see here the progress. I'm just going to jump to the end of this installation process. All right, so the installation process of the plugins is now over. And now what we need to do is to create our username, the username that we'll be using to log in into Jenkins. Now, we could skip and continue as an admin and use that initial password all the time. I don't recommend doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and create here a user, and I'm going to also use here password. Ideally, use a secure password because you never know when you need this. You don't need to provide your full name, but this installation process here requires an email address. So I'm just going to use here valentin@example.com. Jenkins is not going to send us any emails, so don't worry. This is all a local installation. So username, a secure password, and this email address. So let's go ahead and click Save and Continue. This is the address where you'll be accessing Jenkins. So this is automatically detected. So if you want to make a bookmark in your browser, that's fine. Or just keep in mind it's http://localhost column 8080, which means that this is running locally on our computer on port 8080. It's actually running inside a Docker machine, but it is mapped locally on our computer on this port. So this is why we can access this information. Anyway, don't need to do anything here. I just wanted to briefly explain what is this localhost and port 8080. Gonna go ahead and click Save and Finish. And Jenkins is ready. Whew, I hope that this was an acceptable process, but let's go ahead and see how Jenkins looks like. So start using Jenkins. So this is how Jenkins looks like when you are starting it for the first time. Now don't worry if it looks a bit different when you see it. Essentially, the concept should be pretty much the same. Sometimes, the user interface does change a bit, but I know you're smart people and you'll be able to put one and one together and understand where you can find things. Apart from this, I also wanted to show you a few other things that you may want to have. So maybe you don't want to have Docker Desktop running all the time. So there's a possibility of shutting down Docker Desktop, and I recommend first to stop the containers that are running. Now, here in the documentation, there's also a command for that. So super important, you need to be inside this directory that you have cloned. This directory contains this Docker Compose file, which is actually the entire setup process. So we can go, for example, and use Docker Compose down. So I'm going to copy this command here. And what it's going to do here is going to stop all the containers, right? So it's going to stop Jenkins. If we're going back to Jenkins and trying to use it, we're going to see here that there's nothing running on this port. So now Jenkins has been shut down. Of course, you can also go ahead and stop Docker Desktop altogether. There's also the option to pause it. Now, if you're going here to Docker Desktop, you can see that currently there are no containers running. You can also pause Docker Desktop. It's a bit hidden here right at the bottom. Maybe we can zoom in on this to have a better look. So there's like this pause button when you don't need Docker Desktop running, kind of like makes your computer a bit faster. And also if you don't want to use it, you can just simply quit so you can turn it off. Now, when you open it the next time, Docker will not automatically start somehow. So you need to manually start the containers once again. So in order to do that, all you have to do is use docker compose up. So I'm going to copy this command, go back here in the terminal, and it will take a few seconds. But this is nothing compared to the installation process, so everything is up and running. So we're going to see here our containers, status, running, perfect. So we can jump back into the browser, go to localhost port 8080, and now Jenkins needs a few seconds to start, but we're going to go back here to the login page. So we're at the login page. You're going to be asked for your username, and this would be my password. And I also recommend like keeping yourself signed in because it helps. So this is how you can install Jenkins. And for any troubleshooting tips, check the resources. So let's go ahead and create our first job in Jenkins. Now, essentially, a job refers to a set of commands that we want to execute. It's essentially the task that we want to automate. In Jenkins, to create a job, you can do it right here from the start page, but this thing will only appear once, and typically, next time you want to create a job, you'll have to go here from the menu to New Item. So let's go ahead and click here on Create a Job. And in Jenkins, there are different types of jobs that we can create. We are going to go ahead and create what is called a freestyle project. I'm going to see in a second exactly what that means. So this will be our hello, and I'm going to add also here freestyle so that we know that this is a freestyle job. So after we have given this job a name and have selected the type, let's go ahead and click on OK. A freestyle job is a job that can be configured through this user interface. And here in Jenkins, there are different kinds of options that you can configure, and you can essentially click yourself through creating this job. Now, essentially, in essence, a job is supposed to run a command. So what we're going to do here, we're going to either scroll down or use the menu here on the left-hand side to go to Build Steps. And we're going to go ahead and add a build step. Now, what we want to do here is we want to execute shell. So a shell is essentially an interface where we can write commands. I'm going to select here execute shell. And what is the command that we want to use? So for example, we can use the command echo. I'm going to write here echo, and between quotes, I'm going to write here hello from Jenkins. Now, what is echo? In Linux and other Unix systems, echo is a command that outputs the text, which we call a string. So this thing here, between quotes, this is what we call a string. And this is being passed as an argument to echo. We typically use echo in shell scripts as a way to display a message or sometimes to display the value of a particular variable. Throughout the course, we'll also learn other Linux commands that are useful while working with Jenkins and doing DevOps. Now, with this one, let's go ahead and save this configuration and run this job to see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on Save. And initially, nothing will happen. We can go here back to the dashboard, and you will see here that the initial screen has disappeared. So now we are getting here on the main page a list of jobs that we can execute. So we're going to go here again to hello, going back to the job. And in order to actually run the command that we have written to run this job, we need to click here on Build Now. So only when we click here on Build Now, Jenkins will actually start executing that command. And because this is a very simple job, the execution is almost instant. So what we're going to see here is the next part, which is build history. So in the build history, we're going to have all the executions of this job, like a history of all the jobs that have been executed. And the job that appears here on top is the latest execution. So what we can do is click on this green check mark. So I'm going to make it just a bit bigger so that you can see it. If you click on this check mark, essentially you're going to go to the console output. So what is the console output? The console output is essentially where Jenkins writes everything that has happened. So it's keeping notes of what it is doing during the job, and it's writing it here. So it's telling us a few things, but what we are actually interested in is here this part. So this is our command. We have used the command echo to display this text, and then one line below, you can actually see the text that we have executed. So this is, in a nutshell, the most simple job that you can create in Jenkins. This is the hello world job. Now, apart from this way of creating this freestyle approach, which you can navigate here from the top, so you can go back to the job itself, and if you want to change something about it, you can go to configure. So there are many things here that can be configured in this job. I'm not going to go over this configuration for a specific reason. So I'm going to go back to this, and this time we're going to create a different kind of job. And this kind of job is called a pipeline. So every time we want to go back to the start page, we need to click here on top on dashboard. This is how you come back to this overview of all the jobs that you have. And I'm going to go here and click on new item. And I'm going to write here hello. But this time I'm going to write here pipeline. The type of this job will be pipeline. So let's go ahead and click OK. And this is where we configure this pipeline. And you're probably looking at this and you're still seeing a lot of checkboxes and a lot of options, and you're probably thinking like, what's the difference to the freestyle? Isn't it like the same thing? Well, no, there's a fundamental difference. Yes, there's still a few things that we can configure through the UI, but essentially most of the configuration happens right here at the bottom where it says pipeline. And here we can define a pipeline script. This is the fundamental difference between a freestyle job and a pipeline script. Now let's go ahead and see how a pipeline like this looks like. So we're going to select here from the drop-down menu. I'm going to select here Hello World. And we're already getting the structure of a very simple pipeline. So in this pipeline, we have this syntax. So you can see here pipeline starts here and ends here. Then a pipeline has different stages. And everything is wrapped between these curly braces. And we have here a stage hello, and we are using echo to display a message. So it's essentially pretty much the same thing as we did before with just writing that command, but now we're using this pipeline syntax. That's the main difference. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and run it with build now. So we can go ahead and inspect the results of this. And again, we're going to see here the message we have specified when using echo. So the output is pretty much the same thing, but the approach we have taken is quite different. Now let's go back and make another change. So I'm going to click here on hello-pipeline. I'm going to go to configure. If I want to quickly go all the way to the pipeline configuration from the menu, I'm going to select here pipeline. And quite often when working with these pipelines, we want to use shell commands. So this echo is sort of like in between. It's not really a shell command. It's something that Jenkins provides. But in order to write a shell command, we will use sh, and between quotes, then we can put our command. So for example, we can put a command echo hello from Jenkins. So this will do pretty much the same thing, but quite often we need sh to be able to run different Linux commands. So let's take a look and save this and build it once again. So what you should see here in the build history is that now the build number is being incremented. So now we are at build number 2. So we can click on this green checkbox and go directly to the console output where we can see this message. So you will see it works pretty much the same, but quite often we're going to use sh. Here's another example and another Linux command. So for example, we can use the Linux command which is called who am I. So who am I is another command which tells us who the current user is. I'm going to write here with sh who am I, all in one word. And you probably notice here at the bottom, save and apply. And you're probably thinking like, what's the difference between them? I'm going to show you in a second. So for example, if we click here on apply, this job configuration will be saved, but we're not leaving the screen. So this is quite useful if you want to have, for example, the pipeline execution in one part. In this case, I have here 2 tabs open. So in one of them, I can simply go ahead and build something. And in the other one, I can simply keep this window open and make modifications to the script. So let's take a regular look. This is the third execution. We're going to take a look at another command that we have executed. So here you will see here our command, who am I? And the response is Jenkins. So this is how we can execute this request. Now, why do we need this? What exactly is a pipeline? Now, pipeline, as you have seen a bit in the configuration, is essentially a set of stages, or you can also call them jobs. So we only have one stage here, but typically a pipeline has multiple stages. Now, right now, we only have the simple stage, but we're gonna be adding multiple stages to this pipeline, and then it will start making more sense. In this lecture, I just wanted to briefly cover how you can create a job in 2 different ways. And in upcoming lectures, we're gonna explore more how this works and why we do it in a specific way. So don't worry right now if things are a bit weird. Just try to understand how to create these jobs, get them to run, take a look at the logs, and for the moment, you're all good. So I have mentioned DevOps quite a few times, and by now, you have heard of DevOps as well. So what is DevOps? Let me tell you first what DevOps is not. DevOps is not a standard or a specification. Different organizations may have a different understanding of DevOps. DevOps is not a tool or a particular software, nor is it something you do if you use a particular tool or a set of tools. DevOps is a cultural thing. It represents a change in mindset. Let's take a look at the following example. You have a customer who wants a new feature. A business person, let's call them a project manager, would try to understand what the customer wants, write some specifications, and hand them over to the developers. The developers will build this feature, pass it on to the testers who would test it. Once ready, the project manager would review the work, and if all looks good, would ask the developers to pass the software package to the sysadmins to deploy it. As you can see, there's a lot of passing stuff around. And in the end, if something goes wrong, and often things go wrong in such situations, everyone is unhappy and everyone else is to blame. So why does it happen? Because every group has a different perspective on the work. There is no real collaboration and understanding between these groups. Let's zoom in on the relation between the developers and the sysadmins. The developers are responsible for building software, ensuring that all these cool features that the customers want make it into the product. The IT operations team is responsible for building and maintaining the IT infrastructure, ensuring the IT systems run smoothly, securely, and with as little downtime as possible. Do these groups have something in common? Yes, of course, the software, the product. The problem is the IT operation team knows very little about the software they need to operate, and the developers know very little about the infrastructure where the software is running. So DevOps is a set of practices that tries to address this problem. But to say that DevOps is just a combination of development and operation would be an understatement. Actually, everyone mentioned before works on the software, just in a different capacity. Since the final outcome impacts everyone, it makes sense for all these groups to collaborate. The cultural shift that DevOps brings is also tightly connected to the Agile movement. In an ever more complex environment, where business conditions and requirements change all the time, and where we need to juggle tons of tools and technologies every day, the best culture is not one of blaming and finger pointing, but one of experimentation and learning from past mistakes. So we want to have everyone collaborate instead of working in silos and stages. Instead of finger pointing, everyone takes responsibility for the final outcome. If the final product works and the customers or users of the product are happy, everyone wins. The customers, the project managers, the developers, the testers, the sysadmins, and anyone else I did not mention, everyone wins. However, DevOps is more than just culture. To succeed, organizations adopting DevOps also focus on automating their tasks. Manual and repetitive work is a productivity killer. And this is what we're going to address in this course. Automatically building and deploying software which falls under a practice called CI/CD. We want to automate as much as possible to save time and give us the chance to put that time to good use instead of manually repeating the same tasks over and over again. But to automate things, we need to get good at using the shell, working with CLI tools, reading documentation, writing scripts. Quite often, you may see DevOps being represented by this image. While this does not give a complete picture of what DevOps really is, it does show a series of steps a typical software product goes through, from planning all the way to operating and monitoring. The most important thing I want you to notice in this representation is that this process never stops. It goes on and on in an endless loop. This means that we continue going through these steps with each iteration or new version of the software. What is not represented here is the feedback that goes back into the product. DevOps goes hand in hand with the Agile movement. If Agile and Scrum are new to you, make sure to add this to your to-do list. Nowadays, many organizations go through an Agile transformation and value individuals who know what Agile and Scrum are, regardless of their role. I've added some resources you may want to look into in the course notes. If you have some free time while commuting or doing other things around your house, I highly recommend you listen to the Phoenix Project as an audiobook. It is an accurate description of what companies that are not adopting DevOps go on a day-to-day basis and realistically portrays such a transition. This is by no means a technical book, and I'm sure it will be a fun listen. So DevOps is a set of practices that helps us build successful products. To do that, we need a shift in thinking and new tools that support automation. However, I must warn you that you can use tools that have DevOps written all over them and still not do DevOps. So DevOps is so much more than just adopting a particular tool. In this section, we will start working on a simple project. We want to automate any of the manual steps required for integrating the changes of multiple developers and create a pipeline that will build and test the software we are creating. In other words, we will do continuous integration, CI. Continuous integration is a practice and one of the first steps when doing DevOps. Usually, we are not the only ones working on a project. When we are doing continuous integration, we are integrating our code changes with the code other developers created. It means that every time we make changes to the code, that code is being tested and integrated with the work that someone else did. It is called continuous integration because we integrate work continuously as it happens. We don't want to wait for anything to do that. For example, we don't want to integrate work once per week or once per month, as it can already be too late or too costly to resolve some issues. We typically integrate our work multiple times per day, even multiple times per hour. The more we wait, the higher the chances we will run into integration issues. One of the tools that enable CI is a version control system like Git, which can keep track of all the changes. If you never worked with Git before, check the resources folder for a quick introduction. In this section, we will use Git together with Jenkins to verify any changes and integrate them into the project. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. as we build more advanced pipelines, you are more likely to encounter some issues. So it is super important to pay close attention to the explanations provided. And if you encounter any errors, just spend a bit of time trying to understand the error. Typically, the error is trying to be helpful. It's trying to tell you what has happened. You just need to do the effort trying to understand what you did and why that error is occurring. Also, feel free to use the Q&A section to ask questions. And additionally, in the section, you will also find troubleshooting lectures. So if something doesn't work, check the troubleshooting lectures, see if there's any information there. Check the Q&A, see if there's anyone else who had the same issue as you. And if not, ask a question and I will do my best to help you out. Finally, let's do a quick recap. When we have multiple developers working against the same code repository, CI is a practice that allows us to add and integrate our changes even multiple times per day. What comes out is a new version of the software product that we can deploy. If you're still unsure about continuous integration at this point, don't worry, that's absolutely normal. We will implement CI in our development process in the upcoming lessons, and you will have a better understanding of it very soon. So far, we have stored the pipeline configuration directly in Jenkins. This is okay if you want to try something out and we don't want to go through the entire process. However, if we want to truly follow the pipeline as code principle, we need to store this pipeline code in a code versioning system like Git, which is probably the most popular solution. To work with Git and use a Git repository, we will use a very popular Git hosting platform called GitHub. So I'm here at github.com, and here at GitHub, you can create an account for free. For the next part of the course, you will need an account with github.com. It is absolutely free to register for one. We will use GitHub to store our project code repository as well as the Jenkins pipeline file. So go ahead, sign up for an account, follow all the steps, and I will see you in the upcoming lecture. After registering with GitHub, you should come to this page, which is essentially the dashboard of GitHub. This is where you have all the projects and everything. Now, honestly, I can totally understand if you find this confusing right now. Don't worry, it will make sense in a second. Now, in this section, we're going to work on a project, on an existing project, which is actually quite common. You rarely start a project from the start. So in the resources folder, you will find a link to this public repository, and this is a simple application. Now, we cannot all of us work on this application throughout the course, so I will need each of you to create a copy of this project so that you can work on your own and practice all the concepts that I'm teaching in this course. Now, to fork this project, you first need to be logged in. So if you're not logged in, make sure that you log in, and you should see here your icon on the right hand side. So now we are in a logged in stage. To create a full copy of this project, what we will do is we're going to create a fork. So this is in GitHub terms the idea. We are going to click here on this fork, and essentially we're going to be asked how we want to name our repository. Just simply go with the default, and I also recommend leaving this flag on to copy only the main branch. So let's go ahead and click create fork. This will take a minute or two until all these files are being copied to your own identical copy of this repository. And you will see here that you are on the right repository because it says here forked from this repository. Right, so now we have a copy of the code. This is where we typically start with a lot of projects. We need to get access to the code so that we understand what the application does. So what does this application do? Now, in order to work with this, what we're going to do is we're going to check out the code and open an IDE, which is an integrated development environment. Now, if you already know how to work with Git, you can simply go ahead and clone this repository from here. So you can simply use SSH and clone it locally and use a tool such as Visual Studio Code to do this. Now, if you are not so advanced in terms of Git and working with these editors, don't worry, we're going to do everything in a browser as well. So let me show you what I mean. There's this option here in GitLab, which is essentially called Code. There's a tab called Code Spaces. So what we can do here is to create a code space on main. Main is the name of the branch. Main is the main development branch. Development can happen in multiple branches, and for this first part, we're going to work on the main branch. So this is why we're going to create a code space on main. This takes a few seconds to set up, but what we will get in a few seconds is a complete development environment using a web version of Visual Studio Code. So this is how our code space looks like. The first thing that I like to do is to go to settings and make some small changes. Now, first of all, we already know that light attracts bugs. So let's go ahead and select a darker theme. Okay, much better. Apart from this, I also like to enable what is called white spaces. So we're going to check in settings. I'm going to search for white space. And when we have here the section render white space, I'm going to select here all. I think this is it. All right, so what do we have here? On the left-hand side, we have access to all our project files, and we're going to get into them in a second. In this part, this is where any file that we open will be displayed. So if, for example, I'm clicking here on this README file, I'm going to see here the contents of this file. Just as well, I can click here on package.json, I can see the content. We can also have multiple tabs open at the same time, I think. Okay, anyway, now here on the lower part of the screen, we have the terminal. So this is essentially the shell. This is where we can type commands. And when we're developing something, we typically have to type some commands to start a project. Now, this is a Node.js project, which uses a programming language called JavaScript. Now, it doesn't matter if you're using Java, if you're using Python, or if you're using any other technology. We're going to use this project simply as an example to demonstrate some concepts. Between the different technologies and the different programming languages, there are many similarities. So what here will be solved with one command, it's going to be solved in a different framework and programming language with another command. Now, a concept that almost all projects have is the concept of dependency. So project relies on third-party libraries essentially to do its work. It has maybe third-party frameworks, libraries that can help with different things. For a Node.js project, all these dependencies are being stored here in this package.json or are being declared here in this package.json. You'll see here, for example, dependencies. Now, we don't need to know exactly what all these dependencies are, but as a first step, we need to install these dependencies. So let me make it just a bit larger so that you can properly see what we're doing here. So the way that we can install dependencies is by typing the command npm install. And this will take a minute or two for these dependencies to be installed. But essentially, without installing these dependencies, we cannot go to the next step. If you're seeing some warnings here, this is kind of like everyday situation when working with Node. npm is the Node package manager, so it takes care of installing all these dependencies that we need. But if you don't see any errors here, that's totally fine. You can simply ignore what you see. Okay, I'm going to press Ctrl L to clear the screen. And the next step that we want to do here is we want to get this project started, right? So imagine we are now developers, we are new to the project, and we want to see like, what is this app all about? How can we get locally something working? So the command that we need to run here inside this project directory is npm start. Let's see, npm start. I'll type it and run it. And this essentially will create a development version of our application. And typically will automatically open a new tab where it will start the application. So this is the application that we will be working on. It's just a simple website. It has here a rotating Jenkins logo and just a bit of text, nothing special. If this pop-up doesn't show up, maybe you have a pop-up blocker that is not allowing you to open this. So this is the address where this application is available over the internet, essentially. So it's this address and port 3000. Now, the idea is that when we're working on a project, we need to know all these commands. Now, we don't need to worry exactly for this project which commands we need to run, because they can depend from project to project. But the idea is, when we're developing this project locally, we are typing all these commands. Now, the idea is that we want to automate any manual step. But before we can use Jenkins to automate manual steps, we first need to know and understand these steps, right? So we cannot automate something that we don't know to begin with. So we need to get familiar with the tools that we will be using. I've just shown you a few commands, but essentially what we want to do in the upcoming lectures is to take these commands and give them to Jenkins so that Jenkins can do this. So I think we already have everything that we need so far. I'm going to press Ctrl+C to stop this process. And you'll see here that I'm returning here to the terminal. By the way, this is the same terminal that you can use to play around with other commands that we have used so far, like mkdir, touch, sleep, or anything else, because this is essentially a Linux shell that you can use. The first step in getting these commands that we have just executed to run in Jenkins as well is to figure out if we have all the tools that we need. This npm command is not available on any Linux environment, like commands like touch or mkdir, sleep, or anything else we have used so far. But let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go here in Jenkins and let's just try out the new experiment. I'm going to call this simply test npm, because this is the command that we want to use. Going to use here pipeline, and let's go to the pipeline itself. Going to open up here the hello world, and let's begin an sh block, and here we can write something like npm -- version. So this would be the first check. We just want to check, is there npm installed on this agent? Click on save, build, and we're going to take a look at the logs in a second. Now, as you can see here, the execution has failed, and what we're going to get here back is the following error. So we are running npm -- version, but we're getting the error npm not found. So we don't even need the project files. We don't need a package.json file. We don't even have npm installed to be able to run any of the commands that we did so far in the repository itself. Now, this code space is kind of like smart. It knows what kind of a project we have and already creates a special image that has all these tools installed. But Jenkins doesn't know anything about this. Now, to solve this in Jenkins, there are two approaches. One approach is to simply go on the agent or on the agents and manually install npm, which is a tool that comes when we install Node.js, which is a platform for running JavaScript. Now, that is option number one. The other option is to use Docker, which allows us to use Docker containers as needed. The disadvantage with the first approach when it comes to installing all these tools directly on the agents is that typically Jenkins is supposed to run multiple projects. Now, when we are using this project, we may need different versions. So for example, maybe this project is working with Node 18, but maybe we have a legacy project that is using Node 10. Now, there are always different workarounds in order to get something like this working, but typically it's not so easy. So we may have conflicting versions of these tools. Now, Docker allows us to separate this. So let me show you what I mean and how we can use Docker in our pipelines. So let's change a bit the pipeline configuration. And I'm going to show you both running a stage with Docker and running a stage without Docker. So let's try first without Docker. So this will be the first stage. And for example, we can simply try out here something like a command that will not cause any issues. So let's try echo without Docker. I'm going to copy this stage and we're going to use with Docker. When we want to use Docker in a stage, we need to specify here agent configuration. And here within the agent, we need to specify the image that we want to use. Now, we need to specify here a public image. And what we're going to do here is, for example, if we want to run something with Node, we will specify here the image node and also a specific version. So for example, node 18, and Alpine is essentially a very slim Linux distribution that is ideal for CI/CD. So this is how we can specify this image, and then inside here we can write, for example, with Docker. So let's test it out and see how this works. Seems that I have a small error. So let's see here what the problem is. Still need to make a small change. So it's not just the agent itself, but we also need to specify here Docker, and then this image configuration is within Docker. Okay, so now we can go ahead and try it. Mistakes happen all the time. We just need to quickly understand what's going on and try to fix our pipeline. So what is happening next? Again, it is complaining about Docker, and we're getting here the error, invalid agent type Docker specified. Now what it's telling us is that there is no agent which is called Docker. And typically this problem is related to the fact that Jenkins isn't configured yet to run with Docker. So I'm going to go here to the dashboard, because this enables us to go here to manage Jenkins. And then what we can do here is go to the plugins. And it's super important that you don't confuse this. The first by default is here updates. And sometimes, this is just about plugins that need updates. What we need to do is click here on available plugins. And what we need to do is check if the Docker pipeline plugin is available. So we'll see here Docker pipeline. So this is the pipeline plugin that we need. As I mentioned at the beginning of the course, Jenkins is essentially a plugin monster. It's just a skeleton, and we need to add additional plugins to get the functionality that we need. Now in this case, we need this Docker pipeline plugin to be able to use Docker in the pipeline. I'm going to click here on install. And additionally, we can also restart Jenkins once this installation is done. So you will see here, these steps here are pending. And once this is done, Jenkins will restart. This ensures that we don't have any issues or something like that. So it's always a good idea to restart Jenkins after installing a plugin. For a lot of plugins, you can just install it and use it right away. But if something isn't working, you don't know exactly, is it because the plugin hasn't been installed properly, or is it because of something else? So let's give Jenkins a few seconds to install this and to restart. Okay, so now Jenkins is ready to be used again. Let's go back to our test npm pipeline and see if it now works. So now we're getting definitely a different value, and we can check here and see if there's anything else that's wrong with our configuration. So it's essentially telling us within Docker it's expecting to find something. And let's see if there is something that we don't have. So if we don't have image here specified. So actually the error that I did here, this sometimes happens, can be a bit harder to debug, but I actually added here column, which I shouldn't have. So it's only image space and then this name of the image. I'm going to make sure that there are also no spaces here. So it's quite easy, as you can see, to make these mistakes. And sometimes the errors that you're getting can be quite confusing. And, over time, the experience comes, but in the beginning, it can be quite confusing. Like, what's the problem? Why doesn't it work? Okay, so now we got this to work, but we can still need to see here what's going on. So we're going to check here what is happening in terms of the error. So there's no property Alpine for class. So this is probably one of the other errors. So I think we're making here like all the errors possible. And the idea here is that, yes, we can specify here something without putting this between quotes. But if we're not putting it in quotes, it's going to be a bit more difficult. So we can get here an invalid syntax. So hopefully 6 times a charm. Let's see if we manage to get this pipeline to work. It takes a bit longer. So let's see what is happening here in the background. So this is the first time. So you're going to have this command here, docker inspect. And it's essentially Jenkins checking, hey, do I have this image somewhere stored locally? And if not, it's going to use Docker pull to pull this image from a public repository. So this will take a bit of time. Now, this is only valid for the first execution because the first time it takes a bit of time to download this image. But next time it should have this image in cache essentially and run this job much faster. So now it is essentially starting this container after it has been downloaded. You can see here this docker run command. And this is the actual command that we have executed here. So it says here with docker and we're getting the print and then the container is stopped and the job finishes. Okay, so now we have managed to get this to run. Let's check if npm is installed here. So I'm going to use another sh npm -- version. This is the command that we want to execute. So we're still going to keep the echo here and we're adding npm -- version to check if it is available here in this Docker image that we're specifying for our build. And we should see that this job is now working much, much faster. So we had initially 56 seconds to get this to run. You'll see here the second execution is only 4 seconds. So we can go inside the logs and we can see here that we have now npm installed, even though previously on the agent npm is not installed. So we're downloading this Docker image, we're running a container, and then inside the container we can run all these commands that we need, and then at the end we can just destroy the container and essentially terminate the pipeline. Let's quickly recap what is happening when we have a stage where we're not using Docker and where we have a stage where we are using Docker. So in the stage without Docker, controller will find an agent and the agent will run, for example, this command directly on the agent itself. Now, when there's a Docker image involved, the controller will again find an agent that can run a Docker image. And then what the agent will do is will look at this image, will download it if necessary, and will start a Docker container. And then the commands here will be executed in the Docker container itself. And then at the end of the execution, the container will be stopped. So this is the main difference. These commands here are executed in the container, while when we're not using Docker, any commands will be executed directly on the agent. But there is also another important difference, and this is what I want to talk about in this lecture. And this is related to the workspace. What is happening with the workspace when we have jobs that don't use a container and we have jobs that use a Docker container? So let's quickly see how exactly this is working. So we're gonna use here the triple quotes so that we can write multiple shell commands one after the other. And we're gonna keep this echo docker because this is useful to know exactly in which job we are running this. Now, apart from this, we want to check, for example, the workspace. So we haven't created any files, so the workspace at this point should be empty. But we just want to check exactly what is happening in the beginning. So we're going to use the command ls, which will list all the files that are in the current workspace where this agent is executing the job. And we're going to also pass the flag la to create a list of files and also to show any hidden files. So this will essentially list all the files in the directory where we're running the job. Now we're going to do pretty much the same thing here as well. So we can pretty much copy this command and we're going to change here sh command. So we're going to have here, we're listing all the files. We don't need npm version at this point, and we're going to keep here the echo. We're going to make sure that we don't have too many quotes, but I think it looks good. Okay. Now let's say that each of these stages creates a file. So let's use the touch command to create a file. So we can call this container no.txt. So this is the stage that is not using Docker. So we're saying here container no. And we're gonna use here for the Docker stage, essentially, we can say here container yes. So we could theoretically list all the files in the beginning and run these commands and see what is happening. Let's go ahead, click on save, and run this job and see what is happening. And we should jump directly to the logs so that we can understand what is happening here. So First of all, we're going to take a look at the logs we have here without Docker. These are essentially the files that are present, so there's practically nothing inside this directory, and we're creating the file container no. What's important also to notice is this information here, and it's telling running on Jenkins, and it's telling here where this is running. So it's in var Jenkins home workspace. This is where all the workspaces are located, and the name of the workspace is test space npm. Now, if we're looking here further down, we're going to see here the Docker stage starting, and it is in var Jenkins home workspace, and it's test space npm at 2. That's interesting. And then, of course, we are starting here the Docker container, and we can see that we are using Docker. We are listing all the files into the directory, and then creating a new file. Now, as you can notice here, there are no files. So essentially here, we don't have the file created by the previous stage. So what is going on here? Let's also take a look at the workspace to better understand this. So if you're going here at the workspaces, we're going to see now that we actually have 2 workspaces. So we have this first workspace where we have container no, and then we have this other workspace. Let's go back for a second with add 2, and we have container yes. So essentially the job without Docker has its own workspace, and the job that's running in the container has a separate workspace. And sometimes this is something that makes sense, but let's just say that for us, this doesn't make sense. So if you want all the stages to share the same workspace because there are interdependencies between them, regardless of how these are executed, we need to configure Jenkins in a separate way. So by Docker, whenever we have this Docker configuration here, Jenkins will create a separate workspace just for this. And it's going to be a different workspace compared to the stage that is not using Docker. So in order to have a shared workspace, what we need to pass here as an additional configuration is reuse node, and we're going to pass here the value true. So this is by default false. I'm going to also attach some documentation regarding this functionality as a resource to this lecture. But I just wanted to point this out because a lot of people using this, they don't understand why there are so many workspaces popping up here. Why are there different files in those workspaces, and so on and so forth. So we need to run this once and see exactly what's going on. I'm going to check here, for example, the logs of the second execution. So we're going to see here in the second execution, now we also have container no. Now, of course, if we're going here inside this job execution, we're going to see there is a single workspace and we have both files here. So this is what's called workspace synchronization. Want to make sure that all the stages in the pipeline use the same workspace, especially if there are dependencies between them. Let's get back to our project and create a simple pipeline that we can execute in Jenkins. So if we're going here back to the code space, we may notice after a while that the code space is stopped. So if that's the case, simply click here on restart code space, and in just a few seconds, it's going to be up and running again. Now, what we want to do next is to define the pipeline, but in the project itself. So what we're going to do here is we want to make sure that we're not inside the directory. So just click here in the project itself. And then there's this option of creating a new file. You'll see that this file is created here on the root, so at the base of the directory. And we're going to define the Jenkins pipeline in a file which is called Jenkins file. And it needs to be written exactly as you see here. I'm going to hit here enter, and we can quickly go to Jenkins and use an existing job just to get the structure right. So we don't have to really write everything from scratch. We can remove everything that we have here and get started with the sample pipeline. So I'm going to copy this, go back to the editor, paste it here. All right. So now we have made a change in our project. Whenever we're making changes in the project, we also need to use Git to commit them. So we're going to see here this indicates that there's a change in the project, and you will see also this Jenkins file appearing in green. So if we're clicking on this, you're going to see here changes Jenkins file. So we're going to add here a commit message, like something like added Jenkins file, and we're going to click here commit. Next, we're being asked if we want to automatically stage all changes. This essentially means that we're going to prepare all the changes that we make for a commit. So I'm going to select here always. So this is something that's not going to be asked. Now we have committed these changes, but we haven't pushed them yet to the repository. So here we just have a local copy essentially running somewhere. So we also need to essentially click on this button to sync these changes. And we're just going to click here, OK, don't show again. So these are the steps that we need to do when we are working here in this repository. Now, where exactly is this change that we did? So if we're going here to GitHub, we're going to see here that we only have one repository. And if we're looking here at the latest changes, we're going to see here that we now have a Jenkins file. So this is the Jenkins file that we have just added. Okay, perfect. But how can we get this to run in Jenkins? Well, in Jenkins, we need to do the following. So what we're going to do here is, for example, we can delete this pipeline because we don't need it anymore. It was just an experiment. So from the configuration, essentially, we're going to go ahead and remove it. We can create a new item, and we can call this Learn Jenkins app. So this will be the name of the pipeline, name of the job. I'll select pipeline, click OK. Now, when we're going here to pipeline, we're not going to write the pipeline script here. But what we're going to do here is from the select list, we're going to select pipeline script from SCM. So SCM simply means source code management. Essentially, we're saying we want to get this from somewhere else. We don't want to define it here. We want to get it from somewhere. So the SCM in this case is going to be Git. And next, we're being asked for the repository URL. So we need to go here to the repository, and this needs to be in your project, not in the original project. And from code, you can go here to local, select HTTP, and copy this address. Go back to Jenkins and paste here the repository URL. This is a public repository, and we don't need any credentials. So Jenkins will be able to read this. If you're configuring a private repository, Jenkins also needs credentials, but more on that later. Apart from this, there's also the information regarding which branch to build. So when we are working with GitHub and creating a new repository, by default, the name of that branch is going to be main. We used to have master in the past, but we're kind of like transitioning to using main as a more inclusive word. So Jenkins here still thinks that master is the default. So we need to change here master in main because this is the name of the branch. So we can check again here. You'll see here the name of the branch that we're using is main. Okay, so this is another thing. And apart from this, we're going to be asked for the script path. Essentially, where is the Jenkins file? And you'll see here there is no path. So we just want to make sure that the name of the file is exactly as we have written it here. So I'm copying it. I'm quickly searching here. I'm going to see here we have the Jenkins file here. So the path is also looking okay. I'm going to click here on save and click on build now. So the execution has been successful. What we see here is an additional stage which we haven't defined in the pipeline, but this is something that Jenkins is adding. Essentially, it is cloning the repository. So we can take a look here at the logs and can see exactly what's going on. So we're going to see here, obtained Jenkins file from. So it's telling you, oh, you got the Jenkins file from this repository. Telling you where this is running, in which directory. And then it's doing a few things with Git. So of course the logs here are a bit more detailed, but there's not so much information here. So we can see which is the commit message, which is exactly the message that we have provided. And then we're starting here the stage hello. Now, in a nutshell, when we want to make changes to our pipeline, we need to have the code ready. So we need to be here in our code workspace. We need to commit the change and push it to the repository, and then go to Jenkins and click on Build Now. Later on in the course, we're going to configure an automated way of automatically triggering the pipeline every time we're making a change, because this is essentially the full automation. We don't want to manually trigger it all the time, but it's slightly more complicated to get that up and running. So I beg you to be patient and just to remember these steps. When you're making a change to the Jenkins file, you need to commit the changes, push them, and then go to the Jenkins job and manually click on Build Now to build the new pipeline. I invite you to play around with this a bit, especially if you haven't used Git before. Every software project requires a build step. Some programming languages need to be compiled, but in this case, in the case of this application, we actually need to create a production build for this web application. So essentially, files need to be minimized and many other steps that are required for the final step. So there's always something to be done in terms of the build. Now, if you're taking a look here at the documentation, we'll be able to see here that essentially in order to create a production build, we need to run the command npm run build. So let's do this first here locally in this IDE to understand what exactly is happening. In case the terminal is no longer showing up, you can enable it from here right at the top. I'm going to click on this and you'll see here the window below popping up. I'm going to paste here the command npm run build. So it's going to create an optimized production build. And we may get some warnings here, but don't need to worry. As long as there's no error, we can consider this step as being completed. It says here compiled successfully. And we also have here a list of files that have been created. So it says here the build folder is ready to be deployed. So with this command, we have created something inside the build folder which didn't exist before, and the build folder is never part of the Git repository. So whenever we're creating build artifacts, those are not checked into Git. So we have this build folder here, and it contains different files that are needed for the web application. Now, how can we do the same in Jenkins? We're going to jump here to the Jenkins file, and we're going to rename this stage from hello to build. And we also need to use Docker because we need a Docker image that has Node installed so that we can run npm. So again, we're going to define here agent. The agent will be Docker. And Docker itself will have a configuration where we specify the image. And the image is Node. Column, and here after the column we specify the tag. So it's going to be version 18, and we're going to use Alpine because it's much smaller. Apart from this, we also want to set the flag reuse node, and we're going to set this to true. So now we have the build environment that we need. We can start here by adding an sh block. So we're going to have here multiple commands that we need to execute. And let's start, for example, with ls.la just to see what is inside the workspace before we start and what is at the end, so that we can understand what has happened here. Now, what I like to do when we're using different tools is I want to print out the version just to keep this documented somewhere. So for example, we are having here a Node version, and Node 18 is like the major version, but it's not like an individual version. So I like to write here something like node -- version. Just in case something happens, we can take a look at previous builds and see, oh, we were using node 18.10.5 or something like that. And the same goes for npm. npm also has version, so we can print that as well. So this is something that when we're using these tools that we rely on, it's a good idea to do this. It's not mandatory, it doesn't have any impact on the build itself, but it's good later on for troubleshooting. Now the next step, you would think that, okay, let's run npm build. But no, npm build doesn't work if we don't have the dependencies installed. So these dependencies in this case are stored in these node modules. These node modules are not part of Git. So when the repository is checked out, we don't have node modules, we need to install them. Now we're not going to use here npm install. We're going to use another command, npm ci. This is essentially a command that's designed for CI/CD servers. So instead of install, we're going to use npm ci. And then after we did this, we can use npm run build. So then we can run the build. And finally, let's take a look at what we have inside the workspace. So we're going to list all the files there. So I think we have everything we need to get this to work. So let's go ahead and add a commit message and push these changes. Then we're going to go to the repository and hit build now. We can already take a look at what is happening here. So we can see that, where is it? So we're starting here. So this is essentially the build stage. This is the commit message that has triggered this. We are using this Docker image. This Docker image is being started. This is the first command that we're executing. So I want you to notice that within the files here, we don't have node modules, and there's also no build folder. So this is the list of all the files and directories available. There's no node modules there. Okay. After that, we're using here node -- version. So we're getting the exact node version. So we're using the major tag 18, but there is always a specific version. And the same goes for npm. Now with npm ci, we're going to get here a bunch of warnings. We don't need to worry about them. As long as there is no error, these warnings are okay. We can live with them. We're not going to worry about that. And let's see what is happening afterwards. The next command executed, you will see here the plus in the beginning is npm run build. And it says here creating an optimized production build, compiled successfully. So it's pretty much the same output that we have seen in the development workspace. So this is important to first use the commands somewhere where you can easily troubleshoot them to make sure that they work as they're supposed to work. And then when you're ready to automate things, you put them in a pipeline. Because otherwise, if something doesn't work there in your workspace and you're putting it in pipeline, you're just wasting time trying to troubleshoot things in Jenkins. You don't know exactly, is it a Jenkins problem? Is it a problem with the tool? So first, try on your own computer or on the development workspace like we have, and then put this in Jenkins. All right, so we're getting here some information. Hey, this is ready to be deployed. So we're taking again a look at the files that we have. So we're going to see here node modules has appeared, and we also have the build, so they were not there before. Of course, you can also take a look inside the workspace itself. There's only one workspace. We'll see here the build, and we'll see here the node modules that have been installed. So this is how we can build this project. So let's go ahead and expand this pipeline with another stage. So we need to make sure that we are in stages. So we can see the stages begin here and end here. And this is the build stage. So I'm going to write right below it stage. This will be test stage. So I'm going to surround it with the brackets and everything. And whenever we're learning something new, it is always super important to make small steps. So in this case, the only step that we're going to do in this case is to define this new stage and simply print a message just to see that the syntax and everything that we have is valid. So I'm going to define also the steps because they are needed. So what we're going to have in terms of steps, we can simply use echo and kind of write here test stage. I'm going to commit these changes and then go back to Jenkins and see how this pipeline execution looks like. So now if we're taking a look at the pipeline execution, we're going to see here that a new stage has been added to the pipeline. And of course, we can take a look at the logs and see that this is the test stage. Right, so we're making very good progress, but we're still far from actually doing what we're supposed to do in this assignment. So let's move on to the next step, which involves checking the build folder and actually the index file in the build folder. I'm going to replace here echo because this is not really needed with sh. What we can use here is test -f because we're testing for a file, and we can check if build / index.html exists. I'm going to commit and push these changes, run the pipeline, and we're going to take a look at the pipeline execution. Going back to the pipeline, if we're taking a look at the test stage, we'll be able to see that the test command has been executed and there's no indication of a failure, which means that build directory and the index.html files exist there. So that's the first part that we wanted to check, that the build artifact is there. So that's one useful test. Now we actually want to execute the tests that are also within the application. So the application here has the source code. It's a super simple application. We have this app.js file, but there's also that app.test.js. So this is a super simple test. It kind of like just goes to show that it's possible to write this kind of test within the application. At this level, these are typically unit tests that we're running because they are only testing small part of the application. They're not testing the entire application. So it's quite common that after the build stage, we're also executing this test. So let's go ahead and expand sh, and we're going to put it in multiple lines. So this would be the syntax that will allow us to have it on multiple lines. So we're still going to keep here the test, but what we're going to add next is npm test. Now, npm here needs a Node.js environment. So this is the moment when we need to bring Docker to the mix. Of course, we can simply go ahead and write a configuration like this one once again, but just going to go ahead and copy it. But be very careful where to paste it. So it needs to be here at this indentation level. So we're going to have here the stage test, going to have agent. We're going to keep this image because we still need the same Node.js version. I'm going to go ahead, commit and push these changes. And in a few seconds, we're going to take a look at the pipeline. So the execution of the test has been successful. You see, we don't have any errors. Also, go directly to the logs and take a look at the entire pipeline execution just to understand what has happened here. And probably the most important part is this one. So again, we're starting now everything inside a Docker container. So we're running this command to check that we have the build artifact. So they're kind of like super important. And then we're running the command npm test. This is where we can see that the tests have been executed and we can see one passed, one in total. So we have only one test and it has passed. But it's also a good idea to check the logs to understand exactly how successful execution looks like. So in a nutshell, this is how our pipeline looks like. We're using the Docker image so that we have access to the Node.js runtime environment. And then we're executing the npm test command. What's super important to understand about this npm test command is that it can also be executed before the build. So we don't necessarily need a build to run the test. So it's also possible that we may decide to first run the tests and then do the build. There are various situations when that may also make sense. If you decide to do something like this, it's super important to understand that there is a dependency between these stages. So what does it mean? It means that we first expect at this point to run the build and then the test, because inside the build stage, we are running this npm CI. So npm CI creates this node_modules directory. So if you want to play around, you can also try to switch the stages. You will see that npm test will fail because of some missing dependencies. So if you want to run the test stage for the build stage, you also need to run first npm CI. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the steps we need to take in order to publish a JUnit test report from Jenkins. Now, wait a minute. What is a JUnit test report? Generally speaking, a JUnit report is a file generated by the JUnit testing framework in Java projects. And this file typically uses the XML format. So this report provides detailed information about the result of the different test cases, including a pass or fail status, execution times, error messages, even like other statistics that are relevant. These reports are crucial for CI/CD because it allows us to automatically take a look at the execution and to identify how many tests have failed and generally to keep track on what exactly has failed. Now, we could take a look at the logs and see what has been reported there. but it's much more convenient to take a look at a consolidated report. Our project does not use Java, and it doesn't even use the JUnit testing framework. But the testing framework that this project uses can generate reports using the JUnit format. Actually, this JUnit format is so popular that essentially every testing framework has the possibility, at least, to generate it and to store its test results using this format. When we have executed the npm test command, we have executed a test, but this test execution has also created a new directory. And this directory is the test results directory, because this is how it is configured. And inside here, we're going to find a file which is called JUnit.xml. Now, in this case, we only have one test case. It indicates that it has executed successfully and exactly how much time the execution took and so on. Of course, when we have multiple tests, this file will be much larger, and it's typically not super easy to read. It is not designed for us humans to go through this report, but Jenkins can read this file. So let me show you how we can configure Jenkins to take a look at this report and to show it to us in a much nicer way. Now, inside our Jenkins file pipeline, we want to publish this JUnit report regardless if the execution of the entire pipeline has been successful or if it has failed. So what we can do in that situation is we can go here and right at the end, so where we have the stages, so we have here all the stages, you will see they were finishing here. We can add here a post action. And inside the post action, we can use always, because we want to use this always, regardless if the build has been successful or not. And inside here, we're going to use JUnit, and we will specify JUnit where the path is. All we have to do is write here, for example, test results / JUnit.xml. Super important that you double check this path and make sure that you don't have any spelling mistakes, because then you will get an error because the report cannot be found. All right, so let's go ahead and commit these changes. And we're going to run the pipeline and see how it looks like. So the first thing that I want you to notice is this additional stage here with post action. So this is where this JUnit report is published. And at this stage, the most important part is not getting any errors. So you can see exactly what has happened here in the post stage. And what we're going to see here is no suitable checks publisher found. So what does this mean? Now, if you're seeing here this warning or this message, checks API, no suitable checks publisher found, don't worry about this. This is not an error and this is not an issue. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to run this job 2 or 3 more times. And I'm going to also hit the refresh button on the page because something should show up. And I'm going to show you in a few seconds what will show up. After a few executions, what you should notice when refreshing the page is this test result trend. So this will keep track of all the tests that have been executed over time. And if some tests start failing, this trend, of course, will go down. If you're adding more tests, then the trend will go up. But this is also clickable, so you can get additional information about the test results here. So you'll see here, this is the 7th build, and we have here the test result. It says no failures. We can click on it, and we can also go through the tests that are being listed here. So it's only one test, and we're going to see here that the status of this test is passed. So there's nothing super important about this, but it's going to give you additional details. And if something is failing, it's going to be a bit easier to identify which test exactly has failed. So this is the main reason why we like to have this integration in Jenkins, why we want to have this test being displayed here. In this section, we will learn about deployments and take our website project and deploy it to the cloud using a very popular platform called Netlify. Along the way, we'll learn about other DevOps practices, such as continuous delivery and continuous deployment. By the end of this section, we will have a complete CI/CD pipeline that will take our website, build it, test it, and let it float in the cloud. To follow along with this section, you will need to sign up for a free account at Netlify. The process is super easy and takes only 2 minutes. You can use your GitHub account to sign up or just provide your email and a password. After you have verified your email, there are just a few questions you need to answer. When asked about deploying your first project, just select Skip this step for now, and soon you should see this page. If you manage to do this, you're all good for now. Just a quick reminder, in case you get stuck or something does not work, check the course Q&A for similar issues or look for the troubleshooting lectures which are spread throughout the section. Are you ready to deploy this application to the cloud? Then let's begin. Let's begin by manually deploying the application. As a resource to this lecture, you will find a zip archive. Download that asset, and if you unzip it, you should have a build directory containing one index.html file. Once you have that, from this screen, we're going to select here Deploy Manually. So essentially, you can drag and drop that entire build folder here, or simply click here on Browse to upload. So this is the zip file, and this is the build directory. So I'm going to select the build directory and simply click on Upload. And this entire directory will be uploaded. So I'm going to click again here because I trust this website. I'm going to see here uploading. Please don't refresh. So this will take just a few seconds. And then we're going to get this message here, deploy success. So by default, Netlify has created an address for us and has deployed our web application. So in this case, the randomly generated name is this one. And I'm clicking here on Open Production Deploy. I'm going to see my test website. This is essentially a much smaller version. It only contains one file, but is enough to test that this manual deployment is working. So just again, you will see here that you will get your own random name, and this will be the address of your application. So whenever you want to check your application, you'll have to access this URL, but for you, the URL will be different. If you create multiple websites, each website will get its own name. Of course, we can go ahead and configure a few things. So for example, we can change the site name, but ideally you should put here something random because you cannot select every name. I'm just going to go with this one. It's absolutely fine. Just wanted to mention that you can change this name. In the upcoming lectures, we will do these exact steps of uploading, deploying, and testing our web application. But this time, we'll do everything from Jenkins. Now, typically, when we're trying to automate something, we need to understand what are the manual steps that we're doing in order to be able to automate something. So in this case, the manual steps are getting that particular directory, uploading it, letting Netlify do its job, and then going to the website and checking, okay, was this deployment successful or not? This course is a shorter version of a larger Jenkins course that has over 10 hours of content. I've cut down the content to cover the basics of CI/CD. Because of this, some steps have been left out, and you might see that the Jenkins files in the upcoming lectures looks a bit different. This is mainly because a new end-to-end stage that has been added, as well as the parallel execution of the end-to-end stage and the unit test stage. Don't worry about these differences, you can still follow along with a continuous deployment section. You can use all the steps shown in the upcoming lectures on your current pipeline. For more details, please check the course notes. The next question is, how can we get Jenkins to opennetlify.com, then select this particular website that we have configured here, then go here to deploys, select the files that need to be uploaded, and then essentially upload them and generate a deployment. Well, the thing is, we don't have to. This is not how automation works. Automation tool like Jenkins does not open applications, does not open browsers, does not click on buttons or select files. This is not how things work in the automation world. we always need to work with a particular tool to be able to replicate any manual steps that we do. Now, luckily, Netlify does have a tool. It's called Netlify CLI, Netlify Command Line Interface. So essentially, a CLI will allow Jenkins to interact with Netlify, for example, to log in, to upload files, and do many other things without actually leaving the terminal. So this is all command-based. Jenkins will not have to open a browser window or do anything like that. Now, in order to use the Netlify CLI in Jenkins, we need to install it. It uses the Node package manager, which is available in Node. So that is something that we have used before, and it should make our life a bit easier. And this is the command that we need to run to install Netlify CLI. And this is what we're going to try to do in this lecture. I'm going to jump here to the Jenkins file, and we're going to start here with the build job by copying it because it already has the structure that we need. Then here in the test, we're going to collapse these. I'm going to click on this. So see here that everything is looking much better. We can see exactly at which level we need to paste this. I'm going to call the stage deploy. And we're going to check a few things that we already have. So we're using Docker. We need this because we want to use the Node.js runtime. This is what has NPM already installed. We already have reuse Node because later on we need access to the workspace. All the commands that are here, this is something that is not really interesting for us. So what we're going to use here from the documentation is essentially this installation command. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it here in this block. And apart from this, we should also check if afterwards Netlify has been properly installed. I'm going to run the command netlify --version. Now there's one thing I wanted to point out, and this is this global flag. We've seen this before, and for example, when we try to install here serve, we had issues with a global flag. So let's see if those issues persist. I'm going to commit these changes, and we're going to take a look at the pipeline in a few seconds. So if you're taking a look at the pipeline, we're going to see here the deploy stage that has been added after the test. But if we're taking a look at the logs, we're going to see here that there's a problem installing Netlify. And again, we get this permission denied error that we've seen before. So in that scenario, we need to go back to our configuration, drop this flag. And essentially, when we're trying to use Netlify, it's going to be available in this same directory, node modules.bin, and then Netlify, or at least that's the theory. So let's see if this is working properly. So now we're installing Netlify CLI as a local dependency to our project, and then we're calling it directly from the node modules. I'm going to commit these changes, and we're going to take a look at the pipeline. Now, if we're taking a look at the pipeline execution, we're going to see here that the deploy stage is now successful. We can quickly take a look at the logs, and we're going to see here that we are installing Netlify CLI. We're getting some warnings. These are not errors, so don't worry about them. Essentially, in the end here, if you're getting something similar to this, it means that everything has been installed successfully. And we see here the next plus sign, which means that we're running the next command. We're getting back here Netlify CLI and the specific version of Netlify that we now have installed. Of course, it would have been possible to have Netlify part of the project dependencies and store this package.json. That is also a way to do it. Just going to show you another way on how you can have this in case it's not part of the project itself and you need to install it. It's also a good way to know how to install other tools that are not part of your project. The next step in preparing Jenkins to actually deploy this application is to configure the domain itself. Essentially, we need to tell Netlify CLI which application we want to deploy. And this is done by configuring an environment variable. We're going to go here from Netlify, and I'm going to make sure that I have the right application selected. I'm here at Site Overview. And if I click on Site Configuration, what we're going to get here is the site ID. This is essentially the identifier of the site. We don't want to go by the site name because this is something that we can change, but we want to use here the site ID. So this is the unique identifier for the website. I have this identifier, in your account, you will get a different identifier. But as a first step, what we want to do is we want to store this site ID in our Jenkins file configuration. So in order to do that, I'm going to go here to Jenkins file, and we're going to go ahead and define here environment variable. I'm going to write here a block called environment. And the name of the environment variable needs to be exactly as I write it here, all in uppercase, without any spelling mistakes, hopefully. So it's netlify underscore site underscore ID equal, and then we're going to use the value that we see here in the account. So this is a copy button. I'm going to use that. As I mentioned, your site ID will be different. It's super important that we name this environment variable as it is, because then Netlify will know about this. It automatically checks if this environment variable has been set, and if it has been set, then it's know, oh, this person wants to deploy this specific application. Of course, in our code, we can simply check if everything has been properly configured. So we can go here all the way down to the deploy. And for example, we can have here an echo statement, and we can write something like deploying to production site ID, and then we'll get the site ID. We can specify here the name of the site ID. So let's go ahead, commit these changes, and see if we have properly set and use this environment variable. So the execution of the pipeline has been successful. Let's take a look here at the deploy stage and see if we can find our message here in the logs. So we'll see here deploying to production, and we have here the site ID. So this is essentially the variable that we have set earlier in the configuration. So it seems to be working properly. Even if we have installed Netlify CLI, even if we have configured our site ID as an environment variable, it does not mean that Jenkins is authorized to deploy our application. Why? Because we haven't provided any secrets. Essentially, we haven't provided our username and password. We haven't provided our email or anything like that. So if a deployment would be so easy, anyone could essentially take over our account and deploy something else on our website. This is, of course, something that we don't want. So what we will do in this lecture is to generate a token, which will allow Jenkins to use the Netlify CLI to deploy our application. Now, why aren't we just providing the username and password? Quite often, using a token is much more convenient. You can think about a token as sort of like a temporary password, something that provides access to the account, but it's nothing that you can use to log in. So some actions are possible, others are more limited. And from a security standpoint, it's possible to create a token that only has limited access. So we're going to use tokens a lot when using CLI tools. And this is just one of the examples. So how can we generate one of these tokens? Well, the main idea is that we're going to go here to our profile. I'm going to go here to user settings. And from the user settings, I'm going to select here applications. I'm going to scroll a bit further down until we see here personal access tokens. And what we're going to do here is we're going to click on new access token. And you will see here this access token has a few interesting things. So first of all, I'm going to give here a description. So the description will be Jenkins, because it will help us remember why we have created this token. Apart from this, there's also an expiration here. I highly recommend here selecting an expiration like 30 days or 60 days, depending on how long you think you will need this. Generally not a good idea to create something with no expiration unless you really want to have it like forever. Rotating this credential is always a good idea, but let's put here 60 days. That should be more than enough. Go ahead and generate token, and this is the token. Now, how can we use this in Jenkins? Should we go to our Jenkins file and define another environment variable? No, absolutely not. We never store secrets in a Jenkins configuration. Secrets have their own place in Jenkins, and as a next step, we're going to go to Jenkins and securely store this credential. So here's what we're going to do here. I'm going to go to Jenkins, I'm going to go to the dashboard. From the dashboard, I'm going to go to Manage Jenkins. And the next step would be to go here to Credentials. So this is where we can manage the credentials. I'm going to select System, Global Credentials. And the next step would be to click here on Add Credentials. So the kind of credential that we're going to add is not username with password, which is by default, but actually secret text. So we only have like a small secret text that we want to store here. And there are a few things that we want to make sure. The scope is selected to global by default. So this is what we want to have here. Of course, we also need to paste the secret that we have. So this is going to be from Netlify. I'm going to copy it. Don't use the same secret because I'm going to invalidate this after the recording. So this will definitely not work. You need to use your own secret for this. And then the ID will be Netlify-token. So this is the name that I will choose for this. It's important to remember this ID because we will reference this ID in the pipeline later on. So make sure that you have written everything as expected and don't see any issues. Netlify-token looks good. I'm going to go ahead and create it. I don't want to store it in Firefox. So you see this Netlify token will appear here. If you click on it again, you can update value, but this value will not be revealed. So it's concealed here. It's hidden. So this is why we are now entrusting Jenkins with this particular information. We'll be able to reference it in our pipeline, but it is essentially safe. We cannot simply go ahead and expose this token in a way that will endanger our Netlify account. So this is how we can generate a secret in Netlify and securely store it in Jenkins. For the authentication to work, Netlify CLI expects an environment variable named Netlify_auth_token. Let's go ahead and write it here. So it's going to be Netlify_auth_token. So it needs to be exactly like this because Netlify CLI will look for this variable like it also does for the site ID. And if it finds the variable, it's going to use the token that we are specifying here. Now, we can simply go ahead and put the token here, but as I mentioned earlier, is not a good idea. We should use the credential that we have stored in Jenkins. So in order to use that credential, we're going to keep here the equal sign, but we're going to use here the credentials helper. And here, this is the place where we need the credential ID. So just in case you have forgotten the credential ID, simply go to Manage Jenkins, Credentials, System, Global Credentials, and this is the name of the credential. Okay, so it's Netlify-token. I'm going to copy it from here because by copying, I'm making sure I'm not making any mistakes. All right, so now we have the Netlify site ID. We have the authentication token, which we're grabbing using credentials helper. This is not exposed in the configuration, so that's very good. Now we need to check that everything is working fine. So we're going to use here a command which is called status. So using the Netlify CLI, we're going to use a command called status. In case you're wondering, like, how do you know which commands to use? Netlify CLI has a command reference with a lot of the commands that we can use. For example, also status. So status will just print some status information. It's just sufficient to check that everything that we have is actually configured correctly. So we're going to go here to the Jenkins file. I'm going to copy this exact command that we have here. But now, instead of typing -- version, we're going to use Netlify status. And this should print status information. I'm going to commit these changes, and we're going to take a look at the pipeline in a few seconds. Let's take a quick look at the pipeline execution. So the deployed stage is successful. We're going to also check the logs here. So what do we see here? There are a few important information. We have here the Netlify version. So this is something we've seen before. The last command is this one, Netlify status. So it's telling us the current Netlify user, and it's also providing site information. So we know the current website, we know where the site URL is and also the site ID. So if you're seeing this, it means that the entire authentication has been successful. If you're not seeing this, check again your token and see if there's any issues there. There are no spaces or anything like that in the token itself. I've also added a troubleshooting lecture after this in case you're facing any issues at this step. If you're seeing this or something similar to this, it means that everything is okay, and we can then proceed with deploying this application. Now we have everything in place to actually and finally deploy our application to Netlify. So in order to deploy, we're going to check again the Netlify CLI, and we're going to use here the deploy command. This command is not the most trivial one, but I'm going to walk you through this step by step. Now, first of all, there are a few things that we can configure with environment variables. This is the Netlify auth token. So I'm going to copy it from here and use Control F to search. You'll see here, this token is already defined here. This is how we're providing the credentials. That's the first step. Second thing that we provide is the site ID. So again, gonna use the search function here. Gonna search for the site ID. So we got it once here and once here. So we already have these two environment variables. So let's see what we need next. So here from deploy, gonna copy what we have here. So the name of the command is deploy. I'm gonna replace status with deploy. Now, apart from this, we also need to tell Netlify which is the directory that we want to deploy. Netlify cannot simply know, oh, it's the build directory that you want to deploy, right? So we need to specify that as well. Now, these commands, they have a lot of flags, and they're all described here. So one of these flags is the dir flag, which will specify which folder to deploy. So all we have to write here in our configuration is --dir equal, and the folder that we want to deploy is called build. So this is where our build directory is. Now, apart from this, we also want to deploy to production, and there's another flag which is called prod. So we're gonna specify that flag as well. So --prod. So we are specifying to Netlify deploy. We want to deploy the build folder, and we want to deploy to production. Right, I'm going to commit these changes, run the pipeline, and see what is happening. Okay, so the pipeline is successful. This is very, very exciting. Let's take a look at the logs to see if everything worked as expected. I'm going to scroll here all the way down. And what do we see? This is essentially the deploy command. So this is the part that's most interesting for us. So we're going to see here deploying path. So we're going to see here the build folder. We have only specified a relative path. This is the absolute path. It's doing a few things here, waiting for the deploy, uploading files, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, the deployment has been successful. Now, how do we know if the deployment has been successful? Well, there may be no errors. Maybe here, even the job somehow is successful without us checking the logs. We should also manually check to see if the deployment has been successful. So we can click here on the website URL, and we're going to see here we are at netlify.app, and this is our application name. And we no longer see that ugly page that we have manually updated. We now see this beautiful page here. So it means now that with this manual test, we can conclude that our deployment has been successful. Of course, we want to exclude ourselves from the picture. We want to take care in upcoming lectures that we don't have to do this manual step. Here's my face again, and this probably means we are getting close to the end of the course, but don't go away just yet. I know, time flies by when you are learning and having fun. While this course might be ending here on YouTube, your journey with Jenkins doesn't have to stop. Everything I've been teaching you in this course is completely useless without 3 additional skills you should learn as a DevOps professional: Linux commands, Docker, and cloud deployments. That's why I've created a complete Jenkins course for people new to DevOps and CI/CD. This course is a direct continuation of everything we've covered here. But we will dive deeper into Jenkins, building Docker containers, optimizing pipeline speeds, and even cloud deployments using AWS. Plus, we'll cover essential Linux commands that every DevOps professional should know. I'm offering this course at an incredible discount for everyone who has watched this online course. Use the link you see right now on the screen or check the course notes for the last lecture. If this course was useful and in just a couple of hours you learned so much, imagine what you can do with a course that has more than 10 hours of content. But if you have got enough value as it is, thank you for your time. Please give this video a like and leave a comment down below for the algorithm. This way others can find it as well. And if you click on that subscribe button, you might see more content from me. Thank you for your time and dedication. I hope to see you in the advanced course, and until then, take care and bye-bye.